Hey everybody, I'm the Drink Pro, and today we're reviewing the 8-year-old Old Fitzgerald Decanter. What's up everybody, Kyle the Drink Pro here with you yet again. Thank you as always for joining me today. I'm really excited about today's pour. I know I say that a lot, but the reason today I'm so excited is because I get to review a pour that just came out. You know, I don't really go out of my way to work with distilleries, although I like to do it sometimes, but I don't prioritize getting the latest and greatest pours on this channel. Other channels do that, and I'll let them keep that as their lane. My lane is usually just reviewing what people want me to review. So if you send me a sample, I will review it. But today I got the opportunity to review something that just hit the market in the Old Fitzgerald 8-year Bottled and Bond Decanter. This was released in spring of 2021, and a big shout out to Tony Ramsey for providing me with the sample today. By the way, Tony is a member of the Patreon, and you should be too. The lowest level is only $3 a month. That's less than a well pour at your local bar once a month. And there's a lot of really cool exclusive content, opportunities to win things, opportunities to get your hands on free samples and watch me taste along with you, interacting with me on video calls, all kinds of fun stuff. Oh, and don't forget the merch. Now, like I said, the Old Fitzgerald 8-year-old Bottled and Bond Decanter just came out. It's a spring 2021 release. It actually is made up of 2 different distillation dates and distillate that's been aged in 3 different warehouses from various different floors in those warehouses. I didn't find a good disclosure of where those exact locations were, but you get what you can from a big entity like Heaven Hill. It's also the youngest of any release thus far in the Decanter series from Old Fitzgerald. So I think that's kind of a fun and unique situation. It's only 1 year older than sort of a standard release from Heaven Hill, the Bottled and Bond 7-year. I think in the future I may do a Patreon exclusive video comparing those 2 pours. In several of my videos in May, I had talked about the fact that this was going to be E.H. Taylor month. But I really wanted to do this video because I finally got my hands on this 8-year-old product, and I got it before I've seen other videos from big bourbon channels on this whiskey. So I decided, let's rush it to market, let's find a connection to E.H. Taylor, and the easiest and obvious connection is it's a Bottled and Bond product. We know Colonel E.H. Taylor was a huge advocate of the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. So this is a product that directly can tie itself back to the work of Colonel E.H. Taylor. And the Old Fitzgerald brand actually has an interesting and storied history. Now, Johnny Fitzgerald first started selling the Old Fitzgerald bourbon in the 1870s. This was being sold to steamships and rails and private clubs, basically small organizations. It wasn't really a large nationwide release at the time. That didn't come until several years later. In fact, the trademark for Old Fitzgerald wasn't even established until 1884, so it had been sold for more than a decade before that happened. The Old Fitzgerald at the time was not a wheated bourbon. It was just using the rye grain and corn and probably some malted barley, following a more standard bourbon mash bill. Also, and this is pretty unusual, it was a pot still product. A lot of American whiskey is made using a column still or a coffee still. So this is pretty uncommon even at that time to be making things on a pot still. Old Fitzgerald products were one of the few whiskeys that was able to continue distilling during Prohibition. They actually worked with Congress and worked through the Volstead Act and were able to make medicinal whiskey. But shortly after Prohibition was lifted, the brand was sold to Pappy Van Winkle, a very well-known name in bourbon. Now, Pappy Van Winkle, at the time working through W.L. Weller, this was just before it became Stitzel Weller, decided to add wheat to the mash bill. Now, he didn't entirely remove the rye grain. This was not a 3-grain whiskey, so it had some of the rye kick, but a softness from the wheat. A touch of wheat, I believe, was the term that they would use at the time. Now, if you're wondering where these crystal decanters come from, this is a callback to a product from the 1950s when they first started putting Old Fitzgerald into crystal decanters. I'm not really sure if there's any specific purpose behind that, except it's a very nice aesthetic. You can probably sell it for more. It's kind of the same reasons that they're doing it today, to be honest with you. After being owned by Stitzel Weller for a while, the Old Fitzgerald brand has kind of bounced around to several different companies, but it has currently made its home with Heaven Hill after an acquisition from Diageo. So that's enough history, that's enough preamble. Let's get into actually tasting this whiskey. Now, I've actually read a couple of really positive reviews about this, so I am excited to see if it lives up to the hype. I have had mixed feelings about the Old Fitzgerald 9-year, so the 8-year hopefully will end up on the high end of those expectations. Oh, I really like the nose on this right off the bat. I get a lot of really light sweetness, sort of like a cherry cotton candy vibe. Definitely getting vanilla and butterscotch. The butterscotch is very slight though. It's not an overpowering butterscotch. There's a lot of layers in this pour actually, especially for an 8-year-old whiskey. That's pretty impressive. One of the things I've noticed for my own personal nosing notes is the first things I smell are usually the sweet aromatics. And then as I spend more time with the whiskey, I'm able to pull out other notes, nuttiness, woodiness. Sometimes the fruitiness will end up at the back end if it's not a sweeter fruit, if it's more herbal or more subtle or more rich, deep, dried out fruit, something like that. Those notes can kind of vary in terms of when I can find them, but you need to spend some time smelling a whiskey because you're not going to smell everything right away. Don't be afraid to sit there and spend 10, 20 minutes if you really want to, just nosing a whiskey because you will keep finding new things, especially if it's a high quality pour or a complex pour. Now I am getting a little bit of cinnamon in this pour, but it's very subtle. It's not raw spice cinnamon, and it's not the sweet red hot cinnamon. It's kind of a middle ground between those two. And then I'm also getting a very nice sweet tobacco quality, which I really like in a whiskey. If you can keep the tobacco notes sweet and it doesn't sort of fall into that earthy bogginess that is more akin to a scotch, I feel like those kind of live in different worlds. And so when I have my bourbon hat on, I really want it to be more in the sweet side of the spectrum of earthy notes. One of the things that really stands out to me though, at least compared to my memory of the 9-year Bottled in Bond, is that this is not nearly as bright and grain forward. This is a little bit deeper, a little bit richer, sweet caramel vibes is really the predominant quality here. Okay. Starting to find those fruit qualities. I really like a fruity whiskey, and Old Fitzgerald can produce fruitiness. If they can make a nice fruity sweet whiskey at Heaven Hill with Larceny using a wheated recipe, why couldn't they do it with Old Fitzgerald? Finally, we're starting to see that grain quality. The wheat is showing up, a little bit of corn, but not very much. I would say it's predominantly like a wheat bread. This is kind of a weird note, but it reminds me of store-bought wheat bread, not fresh made at your grandma's house wheat bread. Now this smells like I opened up a bag of like, not Wonder Bread, some sort of whole grain bread, but still something that's been sitting on a shelf. I'm not sure what that says. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. One thing that I'm really not picking up though is any kind of oakiness or nuttiness. Those notes just aren't present in this pour. And that might scare some people away, but there's enough like sweet brown sugar, creamy sweetness up front that I'm not sure you really need the oakiness unless you're specifically seeking it out. You know, sometimes whiskeys that don't have that oaky quality feel a little flat. Maybe this one will be perfect. Who knows? It's gonna come down to the finish, I'll tell you right now, before I even taste it, because most of the time, people looking for pepperiness or oakiness or even a nuttiness, that's where they're gonna find it, is at the finish, the last lingering aftertaste of the whiskey. If this has a nice finish, I think it's gonna be a great whiskey. There's only one way to find out, let's taste it. Oh, that's very interesting. It is not nearly as sweet as I expected it to be. Ooh. Very nice nuttiness. Oh wow, the finish on this is incredibly nutty. I get lots of pecans and almonds. Oh, and then after that initial nuttiness passes, you get this lingering light, almost like bark. It's wood, but it's more of a natural wood quality. Let's take a second sip. Oh, and after I smell it, after tasting it the first time, the fruitiness comes out, but I'm also starting to get a little bit of oakiness on the nose. That was not there before I tasted it. Very cool. Okay, let's taste it again. Yeah, that really surprises me. There is very little sweetness up front. And you know, this is a 100 proof product. It's bottled in bond. So it's not like it's gonna be super watered down, but it's very smooth and very quiet. That wheat is really performing its function of smoothing out the pour. It's very drinkable. And that can actually be a negative for a lot of people. Some people really want a pour that punches them in the face. I have mixed feelings about it. It's kind of depending on my mood. You know, I've got like Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, speaking of Heaven Hill products, that are hugely high in proof, you know, 68, 69% alcohol. So if you want a kick in the ass, maybe you're going for that kind of product. This is a bottled in bond product. It's not here to kick you in the ass. It's not what it's designed to do. I think you have to judge a whiskey based on what it's trying to do, not based on your personal profile. And that's something that's hard for me. You know, I try to tell you this isn't a whiskey for me. I don't like this, but somebody else might. that is the kind of mentality I think that really makes a professional whiskey drinker. It's definitely figuring out what you think the quote-unquote best whiskey is, but understanding how your taste and those criteria differ. There we go. Third taste, finally getting that creaminess. You know, it's more like a custardy cream, not a sweet custard, a savory custard. So the sweetness is very subtle and muted throughout the pour, but it's got a great mouthfeel, a great texture, and then it immediately moves from that sort of semi-sweet custard, I guess I'll call it, into this really nice nuttiness that really lingers for me. Gonna have to pour myself a little bit more. And after 4 or 5 sips, I get a little bit of a berry quality early up front. Now, again, there's not much sweetness in this pour, which I guess surprises me a little bit. It's just not very sweet, but it does have some fruity notes, some berry-like qualities. It's almost like blueberry skins or something weird like that, but it hints at a fruitiness. Definitely has a lot of creaminess, and it hints at some sweetness too, but don't expect this to be a sugar bomb. This is not gonna taste sweet, I think, to a lot of palates. I would say the only note I haven't mentioned that I'm starting to pick up after having several drinks of this is there's an herbal quality that is part of the transition from that early creamy, almost custardy vibe into the nutty mid palate. And I really do think that the mid palate is where the nuttiness hits, and the finish is sort of a slight black pepper, slight natural oak flavor. I do think if you are a big fan of long finishes, this isn't gonna be the pour for you, mostly because it doesn't linger that long. I would say I'm getting flavors for about 15 or 20 seconds after tasting it. But let's go ahead and pour out a little bit of the 9-year-old and see how it compares side by side with the 8-year-old Old Fitzgerald Bottled and Bond Decanter. Now the 9-year-old I actually have a bottle of, unlike that 8-year. So I'm gonna try to pour myself just a small taste and see how it compares next to it. Man, those caps are solid. You know, these are very pretty decanters, and I think one of the criticisms a lot of times with this kind of whiskey is you're buying a pretty bottle, you're not buying a quality product. But I think that the MSRP is $85 for this 8-year. That's probably worth $85, just the juice. Now, secondary market, that's a whole other story. Wow, it's like night and day. This 9-year is so much more lemony and bright and citrusy. They're both still quite sweet, on the nose at least. But I do get a lot more of this sort of sugar cane sweetness, maybe even a corn syrup sweetness on the 9-year, whereas the 8-year, to me, the sweetness is more creamy and rounded. It's a very different kind of sweetness. Now let's taste the 9-year, and then we'll go back to the 8-year and see how they side by side. It's a totally different product. I get almost none of the nuttiness. I get a lot more sweetness up front. The grain is very prominent in the mid palate, and the finish has a lot more bitter oak. It's a lot more barrel-y kind of wood, whereas that sort of natural oak dissipation at the end of the 8-year just is drastically different. These are miles apart, even though they're only a year different. It almost feels like they inversed the product. So you have a lot of brightness in this 9-year, and then this sort of muted mid palate, and then a big oaky finish. I feel like the big part of the 8-year is in the middle. It kind of crescendos and then quiets down into the finish. So one pour is sort of like, starts off very sweet and strong, dips, that's your 9-year, and then back with a strong finish, the opposite curve for the 8-year. Well, I guess when I break these two down, I still probably prefer the 9-year, but I'm a sucker for a very sweet whiskey, and the finish on the 9-year is a little off-putting after this very nice, delicate finish, I would call it, on the 8-year. So the 8-year, I would say, is probably more complex. It's a little bit less in my preferred profile because I do like the sweeter pours and the more citrusy pours. But on the whole, if I was guessing just your average bourbon drinker, I would bet more of them were gonna like this 8-year than the 9-year because it's got a very classic bourbon profile with this nice quality nuttiness that isn't too peanutty. It's not going in the direction of those Beam products, but it has a really complex mixed nut vibe while also having a beautiful peppery natural oak finish and definitely having this creamy mouthfeel up front, which is something a lot of bourbon heads are seeking out. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider subscribing to my channel. It makes a world of difference. I'm almost to 1,000 subs, and you better believe there'll be a giveaway when I get there. Now I'm gonna go finish these pours and then grab a bite. You all keep drinking like professionals. Cheers.